So, Stephen, I want to come to you first on this, because initially you were very critical of the Prime Minister, and now you're thinking that he should stay in post. Can you just explain why?
Yes, I mean, I've written an article. My article was saying that, he created the law, he broke the law. Many of us were expected to abide by that law. When they broke the law, they too were punished and fined for it. And as a consequence of that, naturally, and natural justice would have said that he and Rishi should have resigned. But then I took an analysis of previous prime ministers, like Tony Blair, who did something far more significant than that. And all these people that are now calling for Boris to resign never were behind the idea that someone like Tony Blair or any other prime minister, when they've done something as dastardly as that, taken us to war illegally, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths. We talk about a migrant crisis now that is a consequence of those actions today. He didn't resign. And so here I am looking at that and listening to many, many of the people writing to me, uploading on my blog, saying we should have an element of forgiveness for this particular man. And here we are on Easter Sunday, and I've decided, yes, I think I should have some Christian forgiveness for him. And on this particular occasion, I've decided to swing the other way and actually say he should get on with the job, because there is a much more significant thing that he will fail on. And if he fails on that, the cost of living crisis, if he doesn't help us out and the poor of the areas that I grew up in the north of England, then that's the reason why he should go.
And Dan, you've come down on the other side of this argument, haven't you, with your piece that you wrote today in the Mail on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually think there's any ambiguity about this. I mean, Boris Johnson brought in rules and laws that were brought in to not just for an ad hoc reason or on a whim, but to protect ourselves, protect our country, protect our communities from a deadly virus. He said it was the biggest threat we had faced in decades, and he didn't abide by those rules himself. He's misled Parliament. I mean, it's quite clear he's misled Parliament, and obviously he's broken the criminal law. So we have a choice. We have a choice. We can decide. I know some people are saying, let's move on. But where are we going to move on to? We want to move on to a country where our leaders don't have to abide by the rules that they introduce to protect the country. Do we want to move on to a country where you can mislead Parliament with impunity? And do we want to move on to a country where our most senior leader, the Prime Minister, can break the criminal law and stay in office? And, quite clearly, we shouldn't live in a country like that.
Isn't the problem, if I could just interject there, isn't the problem, Stephen, that he said to everybody else, you have to follow these rules, because if you don't, you're going to kill Granny, and, those rules are extremely stringent, and people miss funerals, and they couldn't go to weddings, and they couldn't be alongside their dying loved ones, and so on. And the way I've kind of described it is like, in normal circumstances, if a Prime Minister was caught doing 35 miles an hour in a 30 miles an hour zone and got a fixed penalty notice, most people really wouldn't give a fig, would they? Let's be honest. But had the Prime Minister in those circumstances given an almost nightly press conference telling the nation why they shouldn't drive at 35 miles an hour because, people are going to die, and then, potentially misled Parliament about the fact that he'd driven at 35 miles an hour, isn't it the hypocrisy that's going to get him in the end on this?
And this is why I supported the concept initially that I think he should go, because I remember very clearly my neighbour Norris, he'd been married to Pam, they were in my cottage next door to me. 62 years they were married together, and he died during the COVID period. And we were not allowed to have a funeral for him. We were only able to see his coffin at the bottom of the gate as the cortege went past. And at that time, I could have strangled anybody in government for not allowing us to be able to do the things that were naturally to human beings, bury their own dead. And certainly, at those circumstances, he should have resigned, and so should Rishi, and so should most of the government, but so should Keir Starmer, so should, the leader of the SNP. They have all broken the rules. And that is why I'm in this position. If none of them resign, if they don't all go together, then how can we just stand on one person say you should go? And that's the real hypocrisy, I think, Paul, is because none of them, they've all broken the rules. We saw it many, many times. And they should all go. But we've got a political class that won't move, and if they won't move, then we can't just single one out and say he should go. And that's where I've come to. They should all go, or none at all.
Well, let's look at the kind of politics of this, because in the coming week in Parliament, there are going to be some pretty crucial votes there for the Prime Minister, aren't there? Dan, have you got a read yet of how you think those votes are going to go?
Well, I think, sorry, my cat's decided to join us. I think, well, you'll probably have a better view than you'll have a better knowledge than than I will on that. I think, obviously, there's been a perception that Boris is out of the woods on this issue, and I don't think he is. I mean, certainly speaking to the MPs I was speaking to over the weekend, the anger is mounting. And what you've got to remember is the threshold now for Boris facing a leadership challenge is lower, because there are about 40 names that have already gone in. Obviously, some people put letters in and some took them out again. But there are still quite a large number that are in. So I think Boris is still in a lot more trouble on this issue than is popularly perceived.
And do you expect anything to happen before local elections where all the polling's showing that we're probably going to get a bit of a drubbing?
Possibly. I mean, I think, as I said, I think the threshold is now so low. There is a possibility that something could be triggered. I would guess most people are going to wait and see how the local elections play out, see the reaction of the British people to that. But also, what we have to remember is this sort of partygate is not occurring in isolation. It is occurring against a backdrop of the highest tax increases since the 1940s, the worst cost of living crisis since the 1950s. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, we hear, is basically contemplating resigning on an almost daily basis. So the broader sort of political landscape for Boris is much, much worse than if this was simply Partygate happening in isolation, even though, as I said, Partygate of itself is quite clearly an issue over which he should resign.
Paul, I kind of want to come to you on this, because we've spoken about Partygate gosh knows how many times on this channel now. What have you made of how the Labour Party have handled it, knowing that, some of them, by the looks of things, haven't necessarily stuck to the rules themselves?
I think there's a broader debate about whether or not the stringency of lockdown was necessary in the first place. I mean, the truth is the Labour Party piled in behind it at the time. Anyone who expressed a dissenting voice was effectively shut down. And the reality is that the bill for lockdown is now starting to land, and it's a pretty hefty one in terms of people's health, in terms of the economy, etc., and the damage that was done to the economy. And I think that there needs to be a real debate about whether or not that was effective at the time, whether or not that was right. I mean, I'm not implicitly anti-lockdown. I think there's a call sometimes to say that a nation needs to lock down, but I think if you look at other countries, I don't think the evidence is stacked up in favour of lockdown. I think if you look at Sweden and Japan, for example, who took a more flexible view, they don't seem to have done much worse than us. So in many respects, the Labour Party has got to accept its share of responsibility for supporting something that I think has been pretty disastrous in many respects. And yes, it's not a party political point, because, across the board, parties supported this. And I think there's more than one person who needs to be held culpable.
Stephen, I saw you nodding away there.
Yes, I mean, I think what you've got is the political parties came together on lockdown. They've come together on Ukraine, and we're going to talk about other areas where they've come together. And so as a consequence of that, they all share the same burden and the same responsibilities. And that's why it's very important to consider that if they're attacking Boris on this, I don't see a difference between the event that Keir Starmer went to, whereas was it beers and pizzas? It's exactly the same scenario. And the public are looking at them, and they're all losing trust. My only thoughts about this is that historically Prime Ministers don't resign over a big crisis like this. What they do resign over is a failure in the polls. And so if the Conservative parties do get a massive drubbing in these local elections, as people are suggesting, then that will give certainly Boris an out to be able to resign on the basis that the party is no longer being looked upon as successful. And if he did so with the link into Partygate, then that would actually make him stand out in history as one of those prime ministers that took responsibility very seriously. If he doesn't, he'll just be like the rest.